Welcome to the Dojo, how you can effectively manage remote workers. This is all about how can you get the best out of those people who are not sitting in your office every day. How can you do that without becoming a micromanager, without losing sleep, without being stressed as the leader that you can't actually see what people are doing with their time? You can't see how productive or otherwise they're being. So, I'm going to work through 10 strategies or tips that you can apply to help you to do this really well. So, my first tip is to reframe how you actually assess performance. So, what I mean by that is rather than monitoring activity levels, I encourage you to think about outcomes. So, that is, what are the key outcomes that you need to be able to see as evidence that this individual is ultimately achieving the role's objectives? Now, to be able to do any of that, your starting point is to make sure you've got a well developed position description in place. So, both parties know fundamentally what the scope of the role, what its primary objective is, what those key areas of accountability are, what those major tasks and responsibilities look like. And then that leads us to the second tip, which is to make sure that you've then got really clearly defined goals in place. So it's very hard to accurately assess whether or not somebody is showing up and working diligently if you don't actually have what those measures of success are in place. Spend the time working with the individual that you're working remotely with to identify what are those critical goals that we need to achieve in the period ahead. Now, that could be about setting goals for the month ahead. It could be about obviously setting goals for the whole performance year. So again, keep those goals current, review them, challenge them, make sure that they're relevant on an ongoing basis. Because again, you cannot have comfort and confidence in managing to outcomes as opposed to tasks if you don't know what those outcomes ultimately need to look like. So then my next tip for you is to look at various types of software that you can implement to help you and the team to actually manage what those priorities are and what our projects and our tasks are. What I'm talking about here is examples like Asana, Monday.com. There is another one that's suddenly escaping me. I'm not an expert on what the software is, but I encourage you to go and look at those project management, light touch project management software. You don't need to over engineer it. Basically, a system, again, that allows you and the team to track those major priorities. If you have a routine in place where individuals are then responsible for making sure that those systems are up to date on a regular basis. Say, for example, 5 o'clock on a Friday, everyone has their Asana or whatever system you're using up to date. That creates a level of accountability in the team member for maintaining that visibility of their progress. So it's shared accountability and obviously gives you an information source that you can reference and obviously ask questions around ultimately if you need to. So then my next tip for you is to make sure that you are disciplined in having your regular check-in meetings. You know, if you are working with somebody remotely 100% of the time, then in my view, you need to be having a weekly check-in with that person. So that might look like obviously working through work in progress and what our current priorities are, but it's also a great opportunity to ask that person how they're going. Are there any obstacles to their progress or their success? Is there any support they need, etc.? So again, making sure that we're maintaining those regular routines. If you're working in a hybrid model and so part of the time the team member is in the office, then make sure that you take advantage of those times and you're sitting down having your one-to-ones in person wherever possible. At least I think if it's a hybrid model every fortnight, we should be having those one-to-one conversations with our team members. My next tip is to encourage status updates or brief written reports. So this might look like, once a week, a team member provides you with a status report, again, around. We don't want people writing War and Peace, by the way. We don't want to turn this into a whole other load in their job. But it might just be a one-pager that says, here's the things I'm proud of this week. Here's the things I've achieved. Here's the things I didn't quite get to for whatever reasons. So again, it's just another way of encouraging that visibility, that accountability and ownership from the team member. Another way for you to have some structure around the conversations that you then have with your team members on that weekly or fortnightly basis. My next tip is a big one in that it's certainly not something you can just get out the magic wand and achieve. It's something you have to work to over time, but that's actually working on your culture. At the heart of that culture is creating respect and trust in our relationships, but also influencing ownership. The cultural environment that's most likely to inspire a remote worker to push hard and to have that internal drive to contribute well is one where people feel genuinely bought in and excited around who is it that we are as an organization, what are we trying to achieve. When people have pride in that mission and they feel that sense of collective ownership with their colleagues for achieving something that they believe is meaningful, again, they're entirely more likely when they're working remotely to self-manage and to lean into doing the job because they actually have emotional ownership of the organization. So they're passionately engaged in their work and the organization, and therefore more likely to dig deep and to strive and to work hard and do all the things that we need from people. So again, we could obviously spend a whole video in itself just talking about how to drive culture, but this list of tips wouldn't be complete without encouraging you to really think about how do you drive that culture. Now, if you want to learn more about that, we have our Create Culture e-learning series. If you want to learn more about setting those goals and those expectations and evaluating somebody's performance, then we have our Manage Performance e-learn series that you can go check out as well. Moving on to our next tip. And that is to use data to ask questions as opposed to judge. So hopefully if you've set things up well, you've got really clear goals, you're able to capture data, that's clearly a great thing. But a common mistake I see leaders make in this scenario is to let the data do all of the talking and not engage in conversation with people around that. So again, obviously data is a great source of information, but it's only when we have the broader context, so when we actually talk to the individual around their reality, what have they been working on, what might have been distracting, what might have slowed them down, what are some of those obstacles. Again, obviously we want to have an accurate assessment of the individual, and that's important for lots of reasons, including the individual feeling like we are fair and we are reasonable and that they are valued and they are respected, and all of those great things that again are important to someone's engagement. Let's not destroy that by making assumptions and seeing a story in the data that may not necessarily be accurate. And then my next tip is to make sure that you're aligning on priorities frequently. So again, really common mistake. We set the priorities at the beginning of the performance year, say off you go. We rarely then have conversations around the calibration of our current priorities. And then we're surprised when people miss the target. Again, in those regular catch-ups, in your status reports that you're implementing, in your team meetings, keep the conversation alive around what's most important right now to achieve our vision and our strategy. What do we collectively and what do we each individually need to be focused on to make sure that we are ultimately successful? So then my next tip, tip 9, in some ways I've already spoken to, but just to be super clear, let's make sure we're asking really good questions. Questions are great for getting people to think for themselves as well. And again, it creates that culture of accountability. If I'm going to be asked and I have to explain and I have to share insight, again, people are more likely to be tuned into, okay, I better be holding myself accountable here because there's going to be an accountability moment when I am asked questions. So again, let's not assume. Let's ask questions. Let's leverage our data, as I said before, but let's engage in regular conversation with people to understand reality. And then my final tip is to make sure that we're actually stopping and we're celebrating from time to time. Again, it can be too easy to look past or overlook our remote workers. Make sure that you are actively looking for what are the things that they're doing well, catch them doing those things well. Make sure you're reaching out to them and saying, hey, really appreciated whatever it was. But wherever possible as well, take the opportunity in online team meetings or other public forums to acknowledge that individual's contribution. Again, it's incredibly important. People want to feel that they're heard, that they're seen, that they're valued, that they're respected, that fundamentally they matter and that they belong. when somebody's not physically coming into the office all the time, we as leaders need to make sure we're deliberately influencing that emotional state that they're feeling quite deliberately. And one of the most important things we can do is to remember and to actually say out loud when it is that, again, one of these remote workers has stepped up to the plate and who has delivered. Share the love, make sure people know that they're seen and they're appreciated. So thank you for joining us again in the dojo. As I said earlier, if you want to learn more about how to do these things well, then I encourage you to go check out our online dojo, which has a whole raft of e-learning courses that you can dive into.